Hi everyone, this is Anup from Learn for Taraqi. Today we are going to learn about what is GraphQL and how it is different from REST API. Let's begin. So first of all, we will understand what is the problem that REST API has before we dive deeper into the GraphQL. Let's understand. So I'm showing you client-server communication with the help of REST API. So in this example, client application is making a call to the server using REST API for fetching user data, right? So client application can be anything, mobile application, web application, anything, right? So in the web application, for example, this data the client application wants to show somewhere on the website, right? The client application is using these 4 fields in one of the page. Now suppose the client application on the header wants to have only the name of the user, where only one field is enough to show that name instead of this 4 field. So in that case, even though the client application needs one field, the server returns 4 fields. So this is the problem of overfetching, right? So the second case may arise where the client application needs more data. For example, in the user profile section, it needs more than 4 fields. So in that case, the client application is making the same API call but getting only 4 fields, but it needs more than 4 fields. So either the client customer may discuss with the server API creator, okay, please provide me a change in the existing API or provide me a new API to fulfill that requirement, right? So these are the challenges in the REST API where the overfetching and underfetching do happen in the REST API world. So the possible solution for these problems would be one of the solutions that I already communicated by introducing one more or REST endpoint. So suppose the client application says that, okay, I want to use only one field. So it may ask to the server API creator that let's create one more API. I will use that API in that particular scenario. So we can create one more API with users welcome /1. The second solution would be like if client wants to communicate like what are the fields that it needs, they can communicate by using the query params. By adding it into the query params, says that, okay, I need only name and email, so I will put it into the query param. Let's make your API more vigilant about it and accordingly return back the response. But both the solutions have inherent problems. Like one is unnecessary adding multiple API endpoints for small requirements, right? And second is introducing query params for field selection would be cumbersome and hard to maintain. To better solve this problem of overfetching and underfetching, GraphQL come into existence. Now, what is GraphQL? GraphQL gives the capability to the client to communicate the required fields to the server. If client wants only name and email, so the client application write a GraphQL query in the request body and send it to the server. So server will be able to understand, okay, the client needs name and email, let me return only that particular fields to the client. If the client needs name, email and plan, then let me return all these requested fields back to the client. So basically the response data fields is being controlled by the client. So client is asking this fields is needed, so server is returning back as per the client requirement. So that is GraphQL. Let's talk about REST versus GraphQL. We have learned about the REST problems by looking into the overfetching and underfetching. But let's understand how exactly GraphQL and REST differentiate from each other. So basically, when two systems communicate with each other, what are the primary data operations? The primary data operations are data fetching and data manipulation. Let's see the underlying classification. The classification is when we say data fetching, we normally say read operation. When we say data manipulation, we say create, update and delete. Now how this fits in the REST API world? In the REST API world, REST API says For the read operation between these two systems, we need HTTP GET along with the endpoint. And if we talk about the manipulation, REST API says we need HTTP post for create, HTTP put for update, and HTTP delete for delete. Now let's see how GraphQL API says about. For read operation, GraphQL says you have to use HTTP post and the endpoint is fixed /GraphQL. Whether it is read, create, update or delete, for any other operation, we always have to use HTTP post and the endpoint will be fixed /GraphQL. The endpoint will always be fixed. In the case of REST API, for anything, we have to introduce the new endpoint, new resources, new endpoints. But in the case of GraphQL API, the endpoint is fixed /GraphQL, but what changes is the request body. If we want to read, if the client application wants to fetch data from the server, it has to send query of type query within the request body. But for create operation, client application has to send query type as mutation in the request body. For update, again mutation. For delete, again type mutation. So in the GraphQL world, the call will always be HTTP post on /GraphQL endpoint. The only change that happen in the request body, the GraphQL query. For read operation, the GraphQL query is of type query. For other operation, create, update, delete, the type is mutation. There is one more type which is subscription. We will cover that in the later section. Let's talk about GraphQL query. I already told you in GraphQL world, it will always be HTTP post on single endpoint /GraphQL. And I will walk you through the query semantics that needs to be part of the request body. So here, this query is actually an operation type. If client application needs to read data from the server, the type of this will be query. Otherwise, it will be mutation. For write operation like create, update and delete. For subscription, the query type will be subscription. Then here user is nothing but operation name. First of all, you need to think differently in GraphQL. In case of REST API, we talks in terms of endpoints, we talks in terms of resources. But in case of GraphQL, we stick with the single endpoint /GraphQL, but we talk in terms of fields and data types and operations on those fields. So here the user is actually an operation name, not the endpoint name. The terminology is little different in the GraphQL world. So user is basically an operation name, and this ID and name is actually requested fields. This is what I am talking about. The client can specify what are the fields it needs from the server. It can pass in ID and name to get ID and name. It can pass ID, name and plan. It will get ID, name and plan in the response. So basis on what client is passing, the server will respond. So this query should be passed by a client in the request body, and accordingly server will respond back to the client. So let's see an example of GraphQL country API on GraphQL Playground. So here I am typing in the countries to ask for the name field. So in this response, I am only getting the name field as the response. So similarly, if you want to see the code of the country, I can type in, the client can type in the code within the GraphQL query in the request body, and it will get the response. It will get the code in the response, right? So this, whenever I'm typing in and clicking on this play button, it basically sends this query in the request body as a GraphQL query, and this response will appear in the client side. So let's understand how does GraphQL work. Now, we already understand client has to pass in the GraphQL query in the request body, and accordingly it will get the response. Now, how the server react to it? What the server needs, accordingly it will respond back, right? This is the question. Now suppose a client is sending a query of type query within the request body to the GraphQL server. Now how does GraphQL understand? So GraphQL has a strong type system. So in the GraphQL, while creating a GraphQL service or GraphQL API in any language, right, you need to define the types first. You need to say in the code, like, these are the types for query, these are the types for mutation, and these are the types for subscription, right? And you have to map the resolver, basically a function handler, to the types. So in case of a REST API, these handlers are known as controllers. But in case of GraphQL world, these handlers are known as resolvers. So if you define a query type, then you have to have one handler associated with it. So when a request comes from the client with query type, then it will be mapped with the type definition present within the code for that particular type and matches the type, and accordingly the resolver which is attached to it will get invoked and respond back to the client. Similarly, if the query that comes from the client is of type mutation, the mutation type will get mapped and resolvers will associated with it will get invoked, and accordingly they respond back to the client. So this is how the GraphQL works. So let's talk about the GraphQL libraries and tools for JavaScript and Node.js. First we will talk about the GraphQL clients, then we will cover about GraphQL servers, and finally we will talk about the GraphQL browser clients. Let's begin. So GraphQL clients first. So Apollo client, so which is popular and works well with React Native and Angular 2 plus. Just plain JavaScript can also use the Apollo client. So it has a good integration with React. Second is Relay, which is being provided by Facebook, and here again the Relay integrates well with the GraphQL backend. Although the GraphQL client is not necessary to have, we can simply write the code using the Axios library we used to use in the Node.js world or JavaScript world. We simply has to make a post API call with the GraphQL query expression within the request body. Let's talk about the GraphQL servers. GraphQL.js, the reference implementation designed for running GraphQL in the Node.js environment. Then we have Apollo server, which is again very popular, work with various Node.js HTTP frameworks. Apart from Express, it works with Connect, Happy, and Koya. And then we have Express GraphQL, that is we are going to cover in this series in the reference implementation, but specifically for Node.js and Express combination. Then we have Mercurius, which works well with the Node.js plus Fastify combination. GraphQL browser client. In case of REST API, we make use of the Postman. Similarly, for the GraphQL, we can also make use of the Postman, but the most mature tool is GraphQL, which is an interactive in-browser GraphQL IDE. You can simply make use of this GraphQL in the browser itself and can have much more richer experience compared to the Postman. That's it for now. Please consider subscribing if you don't want to miss upcoming videos in this series. Thank you so much. Bye.